Hi, I'm Siam Pascal. I'm here on the Light Collective YouTube channel, and today this video will be talking about the link between anxiety and the breath and how breath work can really start to support you. If you are interested in more videos like this, tutorials and other ideas around self-care, yogic practice, then feel free to subscribe on the button below. I thought that in this particular video, we could get a little more into the science around what happens with anxiety and the science of breathing and this link. But first of all, tell you a little bit about my own personal journey. So for me, anxiety really started to become part of my life in the later years of high school. And I was lucky enough to be introduced to meditation and some really body-centered meditations, which changed my life. They really took me on the path of yoga and alleviated a lot of the symptoms that anxiety and stress were creating in my body, for example, headaches and migraines. But after a certain period of time, the meditation just wasn't really cutting it. And so I started to do a lot of movement practice and yoga practice. And that also was incredible for me and my stress levels. And so for maybe 12 years or so, I was practicing yoga, I was meditating, but I'd never really properly been introduced to breath work. This was like almost 20 years ago now, and it just wasn't as popular back then. And so anxiety was this kind of semi-constant companion that I was able to semi-keep at bay. But when I was taught breathwork practices, I was actually taught them in my yoga teacher training in India. Everything shifted for me. I realized that I suddenly had this tool that could get me out of a stress state or any other kind of state that I didn't want to be in, whether it was feeling depressed or annoyed or angry or worried, melancholy. Within a few minutes through a breathwork practice, I could get out of those states that just weren't serving me. So for me, learning to go deep into breath work and the ancient yogic techniques of pranayama really created a profound impact on my life and how I manage anxiety and stress in my life. So I hope that this coming video will kind of support you perhaps in starting a breathwork practice and finding really simple ways to alleviate anxiety. So then how does breathing relate to stress? Well, the relationship between the breath, your emotions, and stress is actually very multifaceted and complex. But at a basic level, we're working with the autonomic nervous system. So this is the part of your body which is automatically functioning a whole heap of things from blood flow and heart rate to liver function. It also relates to breathing because we can breathe in one of two ways. We can either breathe unconsciously. This is the autonomic nervous system. So you don't have to think about breathing to breathe. You can be driving your car, you can be talking to your best friend. All of it happens automatically. Or you can consciously breathe, so you can be really aware of breathing. So the autonomic nervous system is one of the primary keys in activating the breath. And what happens when we have a stress response, when we feel an emotion like anxiety or anger, then the autonomic nervous system, which is automated, so it's non-conscious, it automatically turns on a type of activation in the body, which is a bit of a stress response, known as the sympathetic nervous system. And when the sympathetic nervous system is turned on, what it does is it activates a whole heap of hormones in the body and tensions in specific muscles, and it also activates the breath, and it creates a short, shallow, sharp breath. Now, this short, shallow, sharp breath is okay if it's only experienced for a small period of time in your day or when you really need it. But if the sympathetic nervous system, the activation response in your body or the stress response is continually on in your body because you lead just a normal life in the modern world, then what happens is your breath is continuously short, shallow, sharp, and high up in the chest. This becomes a habit, a way of breathing that you do all the time. And the issue with always constantly breathing in this way, we will discuss throughout this video, but one of the reasons that this can also be an issue is because the breath and the mind is in constant feedback loops. So if your breath has stayed short, sharp, high, and shallow, then there's a feedback communication that runs to the brain to say, hey, we need to keep being stressed right now because the breath is this way. So let's keep that stress response happening. And this feedback loop is something that means that sometimes, even when you don't feel stressed because of any real reasons in your life, because your breath is always short, sharp, and shallow, it will create a stress response in your body. The way we can break the cycle is by doing breath practices that activate the parasympathetic nervous system. This is our rest and digest response in the body. So let's move now a little into the science of the breath. And again, this is a simplified version. When we breathe, we are drawing air into the body. It moves into the lungs. It floods through our blood cells and moves into all of our organs in the body so that oxygen reaches the body. And then all of the carbon dioxide, so the waste material of the cells, is carried through the bloodstream and released into the lungs. Carbon dioxide is then released on the exhalation. And as we breathe, there is shape change in the body. One of the beautiful things about what happens on the inhale and the exhale is that there is a movement of air and air pressure. So on the inhalation, all of the respiratory organs and muscles, like the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles around the rib cage, create an expansion in the chest, which creates low air pressure in the lungs. So they're trying to expand, but there isn't any air in there. And at that point, because of the low air pressure and the perfect pressurization of air in the world around us, oxygen floods into the lungs themselves. Then when it's time to exhale, the opposite happens, where all of the muscles start to contract. And as they contract, they start to release air through the exhale, or there's a high air pressure in the lungs, which then needs to be released or naturally is released. So there is a perfect pressurization between your body, your lungs, and the natural world around you. This all sounds quite complicated, but because it's all automated through the autonomic nervous system, we are doing this in a totally natural, perfect, symbiotic way with the world around us 22,000 times every day. We don't have to think about it. How now can we understand this idea of anxiety breathing in relationship to this process of inhale and exhale? Well, like I mentioned at the start of the video, when we are in a stressful situation, our autonomic nervous system activates hormones within the body. One is cortisol, which you may have heard of, which is a stress hormone, and the other is adrenaline, which is another hormone which gets you moving quickly. This is all well and good when we were hunter-gatherers running away from a saber-toothed tiger, because our body's stress response is helping us to survive. And in that moment, our bodies also are so clever that they turn on a rapid and shallow breath so that in combination with adrenaline and cortisol, we will quickly get out of that situation. Now, what starts to happen is that we receive a stressful email or a text message, or we have a stressful experience, and all of those autonomic factors will turn on, and there is no sense that we release them. So you have a stressful conversation with your boss, but you don't go, excuse me, and then go for a run around the block or breathe really heavily for 5 minutes. You sit at your desk and your breath stays short, sharp, high, and shallow. So this can start to become really chronic. When you experience a lot of anxiety, it can move into an anxiety breath where there is a strong focus on taking air in and not enough focus on the exhale, creating a buildup of carbon dioxide in the body. Another thing that can happen when we are in continued states of stress, when the sympathetic nervous system is constantly turned on, is that you can hold your breath throughout the day, not even realize that you've stopped breathing. And you're writing your email, you're sitting there, and then suddenly you're like, oh my gosh, I need to take a deep breath in. So there is a sense that anxiety breathing can be too much inhaling, not enough breath at all, or a habitual short, sharp, high, shallow, and rapid breath. And what happens is that when this becomes habitual, there is that continued feedback loop, which is constantly telling the body and the mind and the autonomic nervous system, I am still stressed. I'm still running away from that saber-toothed tiger. Continue to release those stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. And if you've ever heard of this idea of adrenal fatigue, this is when you have released so much adrenaline into your body and you've been stressed and working hard and active for really long periods of time that you actually stop being able to produce any adrenaline at all. And what we can start to do through breathwork practice is begin to recognize some of the habits when they are arising in our bodies and work with pranayama or breathwork techniques that also activate the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is a really key aspect of calming both the mind, the hormones, and the breath down. So before I get into some of the practices that can alleviate anxiety breathing, I think it's really great to do a little self-reflection on why you might be breathing in an anxious pattern. So some of the reasons that an anxiety breath can arise in your body include, first of all, basic stress. So it's what I've been talking about throughout this video already. You have a stress response in your body. It could be that there's a car coming towards you, so you've got to quickly jump out of the way, or a child is about to touch a fire and you need to grab their hand and move it away. Those kind of factors are why you might be breathing, and you might be leading a life where you're experiencing a lot of stress on a daily basis. There's a second reason, though, that you might be in an anxiety pattern, and it relates to being in a state of general fear, a state of trauma, or even having fear around breathing that can arise from breath issues like asthma. So I have students who have a fear response around the breath because they've been asthmatics for a lot of their lives. And so the idea of even taking a breath in is compromised. And there is a lot of fear around, will I be able to get a breath in? But when we are, even without, say, a medical issue like asthma, and are in a state of continued fear or trauma, it can also affect our daily breath patterns. Trauma and breathing are a whole nother video altogether, but one thing that I suppose I could say is that even intergenerational trauma can have an impact. I was just last night at an Australian First Nations wellbeing conference, educating people on what it is like to be a First Nations person within the wellness industry in Australia. And they discussed how the impact that the government and the headspace within the colonialized world is to a First Nations person and how that affects the breath as well. So, for a First Nations individual in Australia, it's almost as if they feel like there isn't the right to take that deep breath when they're in a state of trauma. And even if you're not First Nations, if you are in a state of trauma or if you are in a really depressed state, then the body responds and the breath responds. So, this could be another reason why you find yourself in an anxious breathing pattern. The third reason that I discovered recently, which I found really interesting, comes from a researcher called Justin Fernstein. And he discovered that the amygdala in the brain not only connects us to our emotional functioning, but also to certain aspects of our breath. And for certain people, there is a kind of communication miswiring that goes on with the amygdala. And for those people, when the amygdala isn't communicating properly with the autonomic nervous system, they will unconsciously hold their breath throughout the day. And when that is done on a continued basis, it releases stress hormones within the body. So even if you don't feel stressed in your life, you may be in a stress pattern of breathing in a completely unconscious way because of your neurological functioning. So in this video, we've created a basic understanding between the relationship of anxiety and the breath and stress and your habitual breathing patterns. And in the next video, I'm going to go into some best practices around how you can work with the breath in order to alleviate some of the feelings of anxiety and stress in your life. If you're interested in more of these practices, like I said at the start of the video, feel free to subscribe to our channel and you will be receiving them regularly every month or so.